I just grab one of those books and I read it. So I read this book called When. And like all business school books, it takes some studies done by real scientists and then mashes them all together and then adds a couple of anecdotes and calls it a book. And so When is about when humans are good at doing things. And so you may know there are morning larks, people who like to work in the morning, and then there are night owls, and there are people in between. It turns out if you take all humans across all of the studies and you pick the single worst time to do anything, it's 1:37 p.m. So it's going to work out great for me. And you're post-lunch too, so I'll try and be energetic to sort of carry us through it. Yeah, so I co-wrote this book with Stefanos Bibas, and that's him. I'm going to take a second to talk about who he is, and I'm going to take a second to talk about who I am, and then I'm going to talk a second about how we came to this project. So Stefanos Bibas is a former professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, where he ran their Supreme Court clinic. He taught in the Supreme Court, and he's argued before the Supreme Court 6 different times. And if you know this model, basically the students work with the faculty to deal with these Supreme Court cases. I worked 12 years as a clinician, and in our clinic we worked directly in the courts we're going to talk about, pro se courts. I'll explain that in a second. But we represented in criminal court and in civil court, unemployment hearings, juvenile court. I worked the whole waterfront. So between the two of us, it's like a penthouse outhouse situation. Here is Stefanos arguing the case of Turner versus Rogers. And so that's Stefanos there, and that's Seth Waxman, and hopefully you know those other folks. I'll take a second to talk about Turner versus Rogers for the people who aren't familiar with it. This is the latest civil Gideon case before the Supreme Court. So if you're not familiar with the civil Gideon movement, it's been a white whale, a singular focus of poverty lawyers, basically from the time of the original criminal Gideon case. The idea is to take the guarantee of a lawyer in felony cases or in misdemeanor cases and spread it to civil cases. Turner versus Rogers is a child support case where the father in the child support case fell behind on child support. We've already heard about this, so we faced show cause, and they ended up, when you don't pay, then they hold you. And they ended up spending more than a year in jail over the course of the case, and he didn't have a lawyer throughout any of this. So as a civil Gideon case, this is about the best case you could get. And the reason why it's the best case you can get is that if you spend 1 day of punishment in court for a criminal case, you get a lawyer. It seems like if you spend more than a year in court on these show cause hearings, you might want to have a lawyer for that too. So in the case, they appointed Stefanos to represent the interests of the mother. So there were 3 lawyers from South Carolina, and then the civil Gideon folks, and then Stefanos. And Stefanos wanted to go ahead and make a straight-ahead argument against spreading criminal Gideon to civil Gideon. And so we went to look around to see if there were people who had written about that and thought about that. And I had written a law review article that was called Against Civil Gideon. And I'll talk about that for a second. So I worked for 12 years in these courts, criminal courts and civil courts, packed with poor people struggling against it. And for the people in this room who have spent any time in those courts, there's going to be no disagreement with me. They're a disaster. They're a mess. And the longer I sat in those courts, the more I thought to myself, this is just not okay, the way this is running. And in particular, because I did both criminal and civil and juvenile, I saw the courts where there were lawyers appointed and no lawyers appointed, and I'll just be frank. In the courts where the lawyers were appointed, it wasn't that much better. It wasn't making that big a difference. And part of the reason why is because it's underfunded. And I'm not here to criticize public defenders at all. Like, my heart goes out, and I trained a bunch of public defenders and love public defenders, but the caseloads, the funding, the amount of time that they have for it just makes that system kind of a mess. And so spreading it to the civil side, I thought was the wrong move. And then second, it's this weird, backwards-looking 1968 solution to a problem when we need forward-looking solutions. And in fact, today we've heard about so many of them, like the sorts of things that the book argues for are happening all around us. So anyway, Stefanos got me, and I signed up to help write an amicus brief on behalf of professors, and then we worked together on an article, and then we decided to work together on a book. I will do this super briefly for this audience. I always start with the easy part, the low-hanging fruit, which is that there's a horrible access to justice problem. This is an LSAC study. This is Deborah Rohde and Gillian Hatfield. They're my heroes and my buddies, and they're the best people on this. And one thing always point out is that it's not just a poor person problem in the US, it's a middle class problem all the way up to an upper middle class problem. And in fact, like many things in the US, it's like the working poor who are screwed the worst in this system. So if you're a single person who works full-time at McDonald's, you're too rich for legal aid, and you're too rich to get a public defender, which is just crazy. So there's a significant problem, and then we need to work on the solution, and we argue that the Gideon more lawyer solution is not the way to solve it. I mentioned that Stefanos is a former professor. He has been appointed by Donald Trump to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And tell you this just so you can know that it is a legit third-way effort. Like, it's not a left-wing, right-wing solution. I like to say it's not a liberal pie-in-the-sky academic fantasy. It's a bipartisan pie-in-the-sky academic fantasy. But actually, the funny thing is that you saw it today. Like, it's actually not even a fantasy. Like, it's weirdly happening all around us. It's one of the best types of solutions. Like, it's making sense and it's winning as we go. So we call it the simple radical rethink, and there's 3 prongs, and I'll talk about some more than others: pro se court reform, computerization, and loosening entry. Pro se court reform. We define a pro se court as any court where more than half of the docket includes one party who does not have a lawyer. And the folks in this room will know those courts right off the top of your heads. A small claims court, debt collection court, family court, juvenile court. There's a whole list of courts that you can think of where they fit that criteria. Well, the simple radical rethink is, instead of picturing those courts where the baseline is everyone has a lawyer, and the people who don't have a lawyer are an exception to be helped in some way, or really not helped in some way, why not go backwards and just rethink it? This is a pro se court, man. Assume people do not have lawyers, and the people with lawyers are the exceptions, and then design around that idea. And again, this is like super low-hanging fruit. We've been hearing about it all morning. So this is the IAALS study. The studies that I showed you before, the LSAC one, and basically they've done these studies in need all the way back into the 60s, and every 10 years it gets worse. Like, it's just a continuously getting worse problem. This is a qualitative study, not a quantitative study. So they actually got people who had been to court on their own without a lawyer, and then they asked them, well, how was your experience? Like, what'd you think about that? And the people here will be shocked to find out that they were not enthusiastic about their experience of appearing without a lawyer. And in fact, it was their impression that they got screwed because they showed up without a lawyer. So they started with talking to people and recording it. And then they went to the recommendations. And again, I love these studies and I present these studies, but the recommendations are hilariously simple. This is what I mean by low-hanging fruit. So for example, here's one of their crazy recommendations. There are these people who work in these buildings paid by the state, and they call these people clerks. These people could be helpful. Whoa, that's out there. And in fact, if you have worked at a clerk's office or been a lawyer or done with a clerk's office, and bless their hearts, but they tend not to be super friendly. And in fact, they tend to have like multiple places will have a sign that says, I cannot give legal advice, go away. Even though these people work in the court and know the court backwards and forwards, it's probably only the judges who would be better off in giving at least baseline advice. This is what's going to happen. This is what we need you to present. This is the evidence you should bring. These are the things you should be worried about. And then there's a second layer to this. And I'll briefly tell a story. So I attend these, actually, I have a bunch of these books here too. I attend these actually for justice conferences, and I bet if you've been to one, you've seen this. So it's the judges panel, where you have the judges up there. And the judges are telling the stories about how bad it is in their court for the pro se litigants. And so, I never do this in question and answer, but I went and got a judge afterwards, and I said, oh, and by the way, so this judge really got choked up telling the story of how bad it was in court for him, and how he had to watch injustice and see people struggle and not be able to meet the rules of evidence and not be able to make it. So I came up to him afterwards, and I was like, that I could tell you're really upset about that, and that's a horrible problem. And he was like, yeah, it is. And I was like, what if there was somebody in the court who could help these people with that? And he was like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And I was like, this person would have a law degree, and they would be familiar with the rules of evidence and the law of the court. And he was like, yeah, now we're getting there. And I was like, and in fact, this person is already there, paid by the government, and knows it better than anybody else. And he was like, yes, we're not asking for judges to put their fingers on the scales, to try the cases for the people. But there's no reason whatsoever why these government employees can't sit in front of people and say, this is what we expect, this is what we're going to have from you. And if someone's caught up on an issue of evidence or an issue of presenting their argument and you think it's actually not just, go ahead and help those people out, pull it out of them. Here's the part where I point out that this is actually not as crazy an idea as you think. This is what most Americans think court looks like. And so, of course, they expect to have the judge active, the judge asking questions and going through it. And having been a clinical law professor for 12 years, I can tell you that anytime you ask a client what they thought of court, they're like, wow, it's really boring. Way more boring than I thought. And that's partially because of this effect. So loosening entries. So there's two significant examples of this, but it's happening all over the country. This is the Manhattan Housing Court Navigator Program. So they train up volunteers who are not lawyers, but are allowed to appear in court with tenants. And the studies show that, in fact, they are as effective as a lawyer in those courts. The housing court's a little bit of a special thing. Part of it's because it's a relatively compact area of the law, and you sort of get the hang of it. And basically, if you hang out in housing court for a while, you get the idea. But that being said, it's super encouraging to note that this could happen. And it's also true that if you appear in these courts without a lawyer, it's really a disaster. New York City has some of the most housing tenant-friendly law in the country, if not in the world, and yet the people who show up without a lawyer can't access that law and end up getting evicted almost regardless of what the law says. Here's the Washington Limited Licensed Legal Technicians. So these folks are not allowed to appear in court, but they are allowed to give advice and draft documents, particularly in family law areas. And they're considering this Oregon and Arizona and California, so there's this effort to try and meet the access to justice crisis by creating this lower level of non-lawyers. Okay. So this is in Tennessee, and it's actually in New York and California. It's here in Georgia as well. And it's weird states, Florida's good on this. Minnesota's got 500 forms online. So they've created these access to justice commissions, and what they do is they create these common forms for the whole state. And it's, again, this is not a tech issue. This is a super simple thing. It's actually a politics issue to get people to agree on it. But they're exceptionally helpful. So for example, in Tennessee, we have 95 different counties, and I think before they had the agreed divorce, no kids, no property form that they created for the whole state, there were 65 different forms in the state. So it was impossible to get anybody to agree on it. So they come together, Supreme Court orders that every county in Tennessee must, not may, take these forms, and then they put them online with instructions. They put them online in English and in Spanish, and now if you have these relatively simple divorces, you can get the form and go forward. Here's New York and California have a whole big chunks of these, and videos explain how to do it. The real power of the form is that once you have a set form, machines are good at working with forms. So this is a program called A2J Author, and it comes out of Chicago, Kent, and it's a baseline program to create these guided interviews. So at the University of Tennessee, I started just this last fall, first time I ever taught it, a class called A2J Lab. And I got 12 students, and I put them in 3 teams, and we got these forms, and we created a guided interview to take them through it. So this is the name change one that we did. And so it starts out with sort of explaining it. I'm just going to buzz through these so you see how it works. This slide says that we're giving legal information, not legal advice. I'm the only person with a license associated with this program, so I do not want to get disbarred. So you pretty much have to say that. Then we say, are you 18 years old? And we explain why. We're only doing adults, not kids here. Do you live in one of these counties? These counties have weird forms. And then, have you been convicted of a felony? This is sort of funny. First, let me explain. So I'm passionate about access to justice, and so I'm happy to get to do this at all. But I'm also passionate about legal education, and let me tell you why I think this class is so good, and the actual pitch that I give to the students. So the first thing you do is you spend a month doing the legal research, going to court, talking to the clients at legal aid, and learning the area backwards and forwards. Because if you don't know the area, then this is going to be a disaster, right? Then you take a couple of weeks and you do what we call storyboarding, which is where you take the form and you put it in the order that you want and ask the questions of the possible client. And again, this is extra basic programming. Like, except for the pictures, I could have done this in my computer class in 1990. It's just branching logic. So are you 18? Yes, no. If yes, it sends you here. If no, it sends you there. So we did the storyboarding thing, and the first version of this, the students were really anxious to make sure that they would get to the really important questions of basically sending them down the tree. So for example, if you've been convicted of a felony, it's a higher standard. You have to do different things in Tennessee. If you've been convicted of a felony and you're a child sex offender, there's an even harder list of it. And then if you're a murderer, it's almost impossible to change your name. So the first version of the website was, are you a felon? Are you a child sex offender? Or have you been convicted of murder? And I was like, that's a lot. Right? I feel like that might be off-putting. Am I wrong? Yeah, so we kept the information but put it in. But again, and the thing that was likable about that is it forces the students to think about that. We also put everything in a third grade reading level. And so it's got these several different real 21st century legal skills. So in law school, I think we are really good, or at least we try really hard to talk about gray areas. And so if you think back, anyone here is a lawyer, you think back to first year, all of the time it was like circuit splits, hard cases, really, really confusing things. You spent all of your time working on it. And in fact, some of the time you're like, oh, you turn black and white into gray. Like, that's the whole point of hiring a lawyer. So that's arguably defensible because that's the most lucrative legal work. Like, that's what people pay you to do. And the more complicated the grayer it is, and of course the more corporations are involved, then the more money you can make doing that. That being said, that is not all law. Like, there's a whole bunch of law that can be automated the way this is. And this teaches them that skill, to take something, break it apart, put it into the orders, and then even on top of that, it teaches them the skill of taking something that's complicated and explaining it simply and accurately. Like, if you can break something apart and make complicated simple and accurate, you're going to do great in the world as a lawyer. And this is part of that access to justice mission, which is the more you automate this sort of thing, the more lawyers can offer services more cheaply to clients. Okay. Yeah, so here we are. After we're not coding, we meet in a bar. Okay, so if we're doing it for free, there's places that you can pay to have it done. Show of hands, I either used Legalzoom or like poked around in Legalzoom. Oh, this is a great audience. Yeah, so when I do this, I've done this talk to judges and the bar associations and just general people in the public. Judges, just no hands whatsoever. And then you go to a bar association, it's like a handful of hands. So I love it that you all have done it. I'll run you through the will one just so you can get an idea of how branching logic works on the corporate side or on the pay side. So here's the 3 different options they have for a will. Basic is $70, comprehensive is $80, and then the bundle is $150. For the folks in this room who care about a market for solo practitioners or small firms, really interesting note here. The $150 bundle is the bundle that comes with this legal advice service. And if you've been to Legalzoom or Rocket Lawyer, they're really pushing that. Like, they basically really badly want you to pay $10 a month if you're a person, or $30 a month if you're a business, to buy this legal advice service. So there's good news and bad news for lawyers in that data. The good news is that Legalzoom and Rocket Lawyer don't give a crap about lawyers. They could care less, and in fact, they wouldn't say it, but the Legalzoom guys were like, oh, we'll just destroy all lawyers when they first launched. So this is an explicit decision on their part where they think there's money to be made in selling people legal advice. So that alone is like, oh, look at that, a human is going to maybe make it on this. The bad news is the price point. The price point is so super low that you know that these lawyers are not making any money doing this at all. In fact, when you talk to the folks who do it, the business model is if you give, they basically don't get paid to give this legal advice. And if you do it for 10 people, the 10th person has a real problem and real money. And so then you say, well, for that, this is more of a legal advice thing, and then they actually hire you, so it's just business development for doing it. Okay, so here's how it works. So you go here, it describes what you're going to do, that tells you how long it's going to be. By the way, if you haven't done it, go ahead and do it. Choose an area of law that you're either moderately familiar with, sign on to Legalzoom. You can get all the way to the end. You don't have to pay until you're completely done. So you can see all the questions in order. And so I know just a little bit about wills, so this was interesting to me. But whatever area you know, you can go through and figure it out. One piece of advice, don't use your real email address. I used my real email address and I didn't pay at the end, and so for 9 months I couldn't go to ESPN without, how about your will? Or, you should complete this. Yeah, so how does it work? You start by selecting your state. No, Legalzoom launched in 2001, I think. And when they launched, they were on nationwide online source for documents. And the original will was for all 50 states. The lawyers in this room were like, good Lord, Ben Barton, that's horrible. And yeah, that's true. It was very roughed out at the beginning. But over time, there are tech companies who have gotten better and better and better. So now you start out with your state, and even some larger jurisdictions like Knox County or Davidson County will have special will codicils if they need it. So your marital status, and then again, you check these boxes. Do I have children? Yes. I've got a dog. I own a house. And again, you check these boxes, and then the machine knows which set of questions to ask you, and each one of the boxes will have a different order to the questions. So here you put in name, address, where you're from. They describe the 3 different types of gifts that you might want to leave. So gifts to your spouse. I physically did this in a room with my wife, so I went ahead and said yes to this. They have you choose it, and again, for each one you can see it's got the how do most people answer this question thing. So Legalzoom, along with the A2J author, we're not allowed to give legal advice. So they're not allowed to say, this is what you might want to choose to this. And then even saying these are the legal options is a little bit dicey. So this is an easy way to get around it. The great bulk of people, 90% of the people, give some sort of gift to their spouse, and so that gives guidance to people as they go. So then this I thought was super interesting, and basically this is why you choose an area of law that you know. So they give everybody who's got a spouse this spousal testamentary trust option, which I was like, oh, that's a little weird. Like the trust thing is kind of complicated, and there's a whole bunch of different kinds of weird trusts you could do. And so it's super interesting the ones that they choose and the ones that they don't choose. Gifts to your children, decided to say yes to that too. Optional charitable and digital specific gifts. So if you want to give a charitable gift to a hospital or a university, you do that. Specific gifts, if you've got a pocket watch or whatever you want to give to somebody, you do that. And then the digital stuff. Okay, so then personal representatives, this is who's going to take care of it for you, and they give you multiple options in case somebody dies. You name the guardians for your children, same general concept. Optional provisions for the will. So this is super funny. I did this with my daughters, and I was like, I just want you to know that there is a disinheriting button. I'm not clicking yes now, but it's available to me at any time. I can go back. And then final wishes, you can write out what it is that you want to have done. And then you remember I have a dog and check that I have a pet, so they want to sell me a $40 pet will because they're super smart about that. I love my dog, but not for $40 for a pet will. And then they can get to the end, and so again, I did a super baseline vanilla version of it, but that being said, I paid a lawyer to do it, and that's what it looked like anyways. And so that's it. Like you go through those questions, and at this point now, if I paid the $70, I would physically get the will from them. This is the business version of it, the plan, and so you can see it's $31 a month if you pay for a whole year ahead of time. And so here's what it looks like, $375 a year to do this. And then there's a certain amount of time you get and a certain amount of contacts you get with a lawyer, but again, they're doing it as business development. And the longer version of this, I show Rocket Lawyer. Rocket Lawyer works in the same manner. Rocket Lawyer is actually owned by Google, so they're even bigger than Legalzoom. So then when you choose the lawyer, and part of the reason I show this is so you can see the wealth of information that's available online in a way that never was before. Also, you can compare this to Avo. It's basically the same idea, but this is the Legalzoom version. So this is our friend. She's a lawyer in Kansas City. She gives a little description of who she is, and I swear I just went through randomly until I found this one. She has a super unfortunate fun fact. So the fun fact is, when I'm not reading a good book, you'll probably catch me out walking my leash-trained cat, Loki. Alright, so it's not okay to leash-train a cat. I'm just on record for that. There's no bet on that whatsoever. And if you do, it's not an advertising fact. And then, at minimum, you can't name it after the god of mischief. Like, that's just completely out all the way around. Just stick with I read good book, and then you're fine. So yeah, then you can see she's got the education stuff, and then the reviews. If you know anybody who's in the small firm or solo practitioner market, you know that Avo is a life or death thing, and it's basically equivalent to running a small restaurant. It's like the Travelocity rankings or the Yelp rankings. So she's super good at doing this. So when she has a happy client, she hounds them until they, I'm speculating, but she hounds them until they put up a 5-star review. And if they don't like them, she just sort of shuffles off and hopes they don't come and notice it. But yeah, you can see she's basically got almost all 5-star reviews and a super high ranking. And again, for the search things inside Avo, there's a money part of it, but there's also a rankings part of it. Yeah, so in 2011, Legalzoom filed to become a public company. We have zero information on Rocket. They're partially owned by Google, but they have released no information whatsoever. But Legalzoom decided to go public, and then they actually sold another chunk of it, and I'll show you that in a second, so we have this information as of 2011. The crazy number in it is 20% of the LLCs in California in 2011 were done through Legalzoom. And of course, Rocket Lawyer is bigger than Legalzoom, so it's just like a crazy number of folks. So they got, instead of going public, they got bought by venture capital, and then in 2018, they sold again. And they had gone from the original estimation of $500 million to $2 billion valuation. So they're growing and growing and growing as they go. All right, let's do this first. Okay, so for the lawyers in the room, there's a puzzle about Legalzoom. And the puzzle is, hey, they launched in 2001 with a Super Bowl ad featuring O.J. Simpson's lawyer. And it was not a mystery that they existed. They weren't like, we're just going to sneak under the unauthorized practice of law, and maybe nobody will notice us. Like, it was a frontal assault on lawyers from the beginning. And yet, the first complaints of unauthorized practice of law don't even come until 2008, 2009. And at that point, in my opinion, the horse is out of the barn. Like, they're already a really big company. They already have a decent amount of money. And there's already a bunch of public familiarity with it, so it's a much bigger deal to try and stop them at that time. So why? Like, what took the bar people so long? And the answer to it is that the first chunk of people who used Legalzoom were not using lawyers at all. That's because hourly fees and rates for lawyers are super expensive. So if you know anybody who's a solo practitioner who works in a small firm, either they or their assistant or somebody on their behalf spends a huge chunk of time telling people that they can't afford it. That a will costs $500, even a super simple will is $500. Or if you have a DUI, the first down payment is 10 grand. Like, you pretty much got to sell your car to be able to afford to defend your DUI. So, like, when it was originally all 50 states for a will, it was a really bad product. So the people who were purchasing it were people who couldn't afford a lawyer, so lawyers didn't even notice that at all. That was like a whole chunk of people they'd already sloughed off that entire part of the market, so that disappearing they didn't notice it. Over time, it got established and it started to eat up, and then all of a sudden you see the lawyers notice. But again, at that point, then it was too late. Okay. So this is Richard Susskind. He is a British legal futurist. That's his actual title. I love him. He's brilliant. He's written 6 books, and they're all basically the same book. This is the best one of them. This is the shortest one. So this is like 120 pages, and he lays out his vision of what's going to happen to lawyers. He separates out between technology that innovates and technology that automates. Okay, so technology that automates takes something that a human already does and then lets a machine do it. So the guided interview form is a perfect example of automation. It basically takes the questions that you would ask, and then the machine asks you, and Gap harvests those answers and puts them in the form. Technology that innovates is when the machine does something that no human is capable of doing at all. And so far I've been showing you kind of low-hanging fruit. I'll show you medium fruit and then super far-hanging fruit in terms of what technology can do. All right, so online dispute resolution, and my buddy from Matterhorn, in the longer version of this, I do Matterhorn too, I promise. But for now, I'm going to talk about Modria, and I'll explain why in a second. All right, so this is a guy named Helen. So I had no dog in this fight at all. I don't own stock in any of this. If I did, they would all lose money anyways. The only exception is this. I went to college with this guy, Colin Rule. He was the year below me. We went to Haverford College, which is this teeny little Quaker college outside Philadelphia. And I say Quaker because it was really founded by Quakers, and it's got a bunch of peace and negotiation stuff to it, but it's kind of Quaker affiliated now. It's not like everybody there is a Quaker. Although you do run into some true believers, and Colin Rule was a true believer. This is a representative sample of his Facebook feed. It's Jimmy Carter talking about peace, and it's just like nothing but that, his Facebook feed. There's the occasional picture of his kids, but it's mostly this sort of thing. So Colin Rule is not a lawyer, and he's not a computer programmer. He is a mediation nut. And so he ran the mediation program at Haverford, and then he went to the Peace Corps, and then he came back and went to Harvard and studied online dispute resolution and mediation at the Kennedy School, and then he wrote a book about online dispute resolution. And that led him to eBay. So when eBay launched, for the first 9 to 15 months of eBay's existence, they had an actual customer service department. And so they had people in a room with a headset who would answer the phone and be like, eBay, how can I help you? And the person would say, my thing didn't arrive, or my package came broken up, or I ordered this and I got that, and then they would try and solve it as a human. So they had 850% month-over-month growth in terms of the transactions on eBay. It just was more popular than they ever could have possibly imagined it. And after 6 months, they were like, we're going to have warehouses filled with humans answering these problems. We're going to be nothing but a dispute resolution company at its disaster. We need to find some way to automate it. So they went and they hired Colin Rule to do it. And he created an online dispute resolution system for eBay that he's since licensed. I'll explain in a second. But first, I'm going to tell a story about eBay. Can anybody tell me what this is? Okay, beautiful. So I give a version of this talk to the entire first-year class at the University of Tennessee, and they have no idea what this is. So you've already aged yourself by saying that you know what a HUML is. In fact, the last fall, I gave the talk, and I was like, does anyone know what this is? And there's just total no hands at all. And then all of a sudden, way in the back, this woman raises her hand, and I'm like, yes. And she's like, that's a HUML. And I was like, do you know what that is? And she's like, yeah, it's this German figurine. And I'll explain what it is in a second. Anyhow, at the end of class, one of the students who's in my George class comes up, and she's like, oh, I just really want to apologize for that mom answering your question. And I was like, why? She's like, that was huge help. Nobody knew what it was. And she's like, oh, that was my mom. I told my mom to come. I thought she might like to see you speak. Yeah, so HUML figurines. If any HUML experts are out there, you can correct me. Yeah, so this is a little figurine made in Germany, originally between World War I and World War II. And they continue to be made up to the present day, and they got to be very, very popular. And they all look like this. They're like little German kids doing German things. So the kid on the left here, he should be gathering strawberries, but he's a naughty boy, and he's looking off into the sky. The guy on the other side here, now at least he's got the carrots, so that's good. But that beer stein is not a long-term success. That's as big as his entire torso. That's not going to work out for him long-term. So, like many other things in America, there's an actual fever around these things. This is an actual magazine for HUML enthusiasts called Hummel Insights. And it covers the best Hummels and people who collect Hummels, and if you become a member of this Hummel Collecting Society, you can get a copy of this magazine. So why do I know about this? So my Uncle Victor and Aunt Linda are Hummel enthusiasts. This is their actual hobby, is to collect Hummels. And so before eBay existed, this is what they would do. Literally several weekends a month, they would get my Uncle Victor's car, and they would drive someplace nearby, and they would go to what they called an antique shop, but was in fact a junk shop, for sure. And then they would try and find Hummels. Okay, now the real fun of this is if you go to enough junk shops, you find Hummels that are mispriced. And in fact, they'll be radically mispriced. You'll see a $50 Hummel for $5. And if you're Uncle Victor and Aunt Linda, that's the greatest. Like, you just hit it, right? So there's these rare Hummels, and you're just driving around looking for them, and eventually you find it, and you're thrilled. And of course, they got a good cop, bad cop routine where Aunt Linda brings it up, and she's like, this is kind of pretty, to the owner. And then Uncle Victor's like, it looks like it's chipped. I don't know if we want that one. And you know, it's $5 for a $50 Hummel. And so and then Aunt Linda's like, oh, but I really like it. And Uncle Victor's like, how about $250? And then he tries to work them down on the price of it. So then they get the Hummels and they bring them home. This is not a joke. They've got 10 floor-to-ceiling glass boxes filled with nothing but Hummels. They've got the entire Hummel collection from the beginning to the end. And if you take them to the glass case, you go case 7, shelf 3, row 2, you point at it and you're like, Victor, tell me that story. He's like, Evansville, Indiana. I remember it well. So the sad news is that eBay came along. So at first, this kind of broke Uncle Victor and Linda's heart, because why drive to a junk store if everything is properly priced? And now even junk stores know to check online for eBay, and so now the Hummels are all the right prices at the places. And so a whole bunch of the joy went out of it. And for a year after eBay, I would go and I would visit them, and they'd just be bummed out about it. Well, if you know anything about eBay, they soon found a brand new joy, which was buying and selling Hummels on eBay. Because they had so many Hummels, they had backup Hummels, extra Hummels, Hummels in the garage, and they knew the market so well that they could pick and choose their spots to sell them in what I meanly call Hummel arbitrage. So even with eBay, you will sometimes find a Hummel that's radically underpriced or radically overpriced, and so they can jump on the market and work it. And if you're concerned about obesity in America, this story tells you much about it. My uncle's hobby used to be walking around in shops, and now his hobby is sitting in front of a computer working eBay. But if you've done eBay, you know that it's super fun. Right? It's extra fun, so he really, really enjoys it. Well, when you get in the large-scale Hummel buying and selling business, you will occasionally have a dispute. So why? So one version of the dispute, and I just got all these from my uncle. One version of the dispute is he ships the Hummel off, it arrives, the person opens it up, and it's broken. So the person goes to the eBay Dispute Resolution Center and is like, dude, I bought this $50 Hummel and it came and it was broken. And my Uncle Victor's like, oh, that Hummel wasn't broken. There's no way that Hummel was broken. Linda, did you see me wrap that up? I wrap it up extra tight. No chance. So I was like, so why does he have a picture of a broken Hummel? I'm glad you asked. He already had that broken Hummel. He wants a free Hummel from me. He gets the broken Hummel. He takes a picture of it. He buys a new one, and then he complains that the broken one's the new one, and he gets it for free. And I was like, maybe. That's an even crazier hobby than your hobby. Like for 45 months, this guy's going to take pictures of broken Hummels. But maybe. But on the flip side, my uncle will sometimes buy a Hummel, open it up, and it's a Chinese knockoff. And he's like, what kind of fool did they take me for? You think I don't know my Hummels? Look at the paint on the feet. The feet are all wrong. That's not a real Hummel. So they end up at the Dispute Resolution Center. Okay, so they hired my buddy Colin Rule to design it, and they wanted to automate it as much as possible. So here's the program. So the first thing you do is you arrive, and it asks you to describe the problem. And if you look at this is the first area. There's a whole bunch of standardized problems, so that they've had enough experience with it where they don't even have to negotiate with it at all. So the classic one is, I haven't received it yet. So when they haven't received it yet, you already signed in, you've already told them what the transaction is, so the machine just looks at the shipping data and finds out. If you haven't received it yet because it's still in the mail, they tell you that. If you have received it, then they show you a picture of the signature or the picture of when you got it at that time, and then you can go forward from there. If you don't have a standard problem with a standard solution, and by the way, part of it, because they're a tech company, is everything moves up a module, right? So they're trying to push everything into the standard solution box. As they gain more experience, they give you more of these standard options. If it's a more complicated one, then you get into the actual mediation part. The parties write to each other. So this is what my problem is, this is what my answer is. And again, they're a tech company. And just pause for a second. So all of this data is from eBay, so take it or leave it as you will. eBay says that they only have disputes in about 0.1% of their transactions. So it's a really low level of disputes. They have so many transactions that in 2011, they had more disputes than every formal court in the US. Like county, state, local, city, all of it. Like they just have this massive number of disputes. And they're doing it all through here. They are running the world's largest recorded dispute resolution experiment ever, because they have all of this data that they're working from it. So the people describe the problem to each other, and then the machine tries to negotiate it. And just pause for a second, they're a tech company. So there's all these if you know human mediators, they have the same thing. There's all these interesting questions like, what's the best way to do it? Should you start right at the middle between the parties? Should you try and push one party this direction, one party that direction? And so the machine tests all of these, and they use the data to continuously sort of phase down on what the best approach to it is. If it fails in the second module, then they do the third module, human-assisted mediation. So they don't start from scratch. They have a human mediator. The human mediator reads everything that's already been there, takes one more stab at settling it. They can't settle it, then they go to human arbitration. Again, they don't start from scratch. The arbitrator reads everything that's been said, makes a decision, and that's it. If you fail to abide by the decision, you're tossed off of eBay, which is why this can work, right? They're not an official court, but basically if you sell Hummels and you're not on eBay, you've got a lot of Hummels on your hands. So people actually listen. If the arbitration rule comes in, they go ahead and follow it. eBay says that the vast majority is handled without humans in it. And again, over time, they're continuously making complex problems into simple problems, arbitration problems into mediation problems, and up the chain. So they took the technology and they licensed it and they sold it to this company called Tyler Technologies, which you may or may not know. Tyler Technologies is the biggest provider of court data systems in the US, and so they're rolling out Modri as part of their platform. And depending on the location, they're giving it away for free, and part of the idea is that this will sort of generate interest and we'll be able to sell more. So you can see the traditional case life cycle. They just slap the Modri in ahead of human mediation if there's going to be human mediation. So if you've been in a divorce court in the US, it's super likely there's mandatory mediation. This would be upstream from that, and you'd have the computer do it. In the UK, they're rolling it out in courts of £25,000 or less. It's going to be a Modria type platform. And £25,000 is not small claims court. Like that's getting to be a medium-sized court. That's going to be a lot of cases there. Singapore courts are crazy. Like they're Singapore, so they can do this, but almost every court is online and run through some version of this. Okay, how are we doing for time? Not close? Okay. If you get a chance, you should go look at this. This is the online divorce platform that they created for the Netherlands. It's unbelievably detailed. It's like Modria on speed. You can't believe how detailed it is. It didn't actually work in the Netherlands, and it's not clear it would work here. But just to get a sense of what this product can do, this is totally worth looking at. With that, I will rest. Thanks, y'all.